welcome. We'll start off with a prayer as we continue to work through the Book of Esther, closing in on the end. I think we got 2 chapters left. After today, we'll have 2 chapters left, so let's pray. Gracious Father in heaven, we thank you for your word. As we study your word, help us grow in appreciation of all that you do for your people. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. So the first question that I have for us today as we're getting ready to jump into Esther Chapter 7 and 8 is take a moment and discuss with those around you the amazing turn of events that leads to Haman being scared as he is rushed off to Queen Esther's banquet. And that's really the last couple of verses, right, of chapter 6. So you get him talking to Zeresh, and he is distraught because of everything that's taking place. And he's then, the very last thing that we see is that the eunuchs arrive and they rushed Haman off to the banquet that Esther had prepared. So, what events lead up to this point? What can we remember?
Well, the king couldn't sleep, and so he had the chronicles read to him, found out that Mordecai had not been acknowledged for his faithfulness to the king, and ordered or had Haman come into the court and had asked Haman what should be done for to somebody that the king is pleased to honor. And Haman is thinking in his mind, who would be more pleased than he'd be more pleased with than me. Boy, was he mistaken.
Yeah, the irony that we find in this section is quite amazing, right? Esther goes, and what does she do? Instead of saying to the king right away, "Save my people, please," she waits a day. Why? We're not for sure, but that gives the Lord time to do his work. As Deb said, the king couldn't sleep. The book of Annals is open. That specific account of Mordecai is read, and now the king has Mordecai in his head, but not in a bad way, in a good way. And his desire is to exalt him and honor him. And then in walks Haman. Haman actually comes up with the plan that will be exacted upon Mordecai on how he is to be honored. And that all takes place. He does all of that. And now, then he gets back and he's distraught, right? Because he's seen that the one person that he was going to ask the king to hang on that very day, he was asked to then honor him throughout the kingdom. And so Haman is distraught. He comes back, and his wife, we didn't talk too much about it. We'll talk a little bit more about it later today. But his wife, Zeresh, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish descent, she says, you will not overcome him. Instead, you will surely fall before him. And all of this starts to get Haman very discouraged, and then he gets whisked off to this banquet of Esther's. Yeah.
And it's just such a plot twist that 24 hours prior, she was saying,
Right. Yeah, it's an amazing turn of events. And so the story continues, right? And it only gets better as we read through chapter 7. And so what's what we're going to do next? We're going to read through chapter 7. And as we read through this, I think the first question is, it's kind of amazing to see, where we have been in the last 24 hours at the banquet, and now where we are to begin with, and we'll pick up the keep going. So here it is. So the king and Haman went to the feast of Queen Esther, and then on the second day, when they were drinking wine, the king said to Esther, "What is your request, Queen Esther? It will be given to you. What you are seeking, up to half the kingdom, it's yours." Queen Esther responded, "My king, if I have found favor in your eyes, and if it pleases the king, I am asking that my life be spared." And I am seeking the lives of my people, because I and my people have been sold to be destroyed and to be killed and to be annihilated. If we were merely being sold to be male and female slaves, I would have remained silent, because that would not have been bad enough to be a reason to bother the king. King Xerxes spoke up, and he said to Queen Esther, "Who is this? And where is this person who has the audacity to do this?" Esther said, "This hateful enemy is the evil Haman." Haman was terrified in the presence of the king and the queen. The king rose angrily from the place where they were drinking wine and went to the garden. But Haman stayed to beg for his life from Queen Esther, because he saw the king had evil plans for him. And just as the king was returning from the palace garden to the hall where they had been drinking wine, Haman was falling onto the couch on which Esther was lying. And the king said, "Will he even assault the queen when I am in the building?" As soon as the words left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. In addition, Harbona, one of the eunuchs present with the king, said, "You know, there is a gallows 75 feet high standing by the house of Haman, which he made for Mordecai, the person who spoke up for the benefit of the king." And the king said, "Hang him on it." So they hanged Haman on the gallows, which he had prepared for Mordecai, and the king's anger subsided. All right, so there's chapter 7, and the first question is, what does Xerxes do in order to kind of take the pressure off Esther at the banquet?
You asked your question.
What did he say?
Who is this? And who's this
Well, no,
person?
even before that. 100%, we'll get to that, but
What is your request?
yeah. So Esther went before the king, remember the day before, and was like, "I have a request." And the king's like, "Well, what is it?" And what does the king say when he sees Esther? He puts his scepter down to her to acknowledge that she's safe, that he wants to see what's going on, that he's delighted to see her. And then the question that he asks earlier on in Esther 5, 3 and 6, it's the same thing, right? He says, "What's your request, Queen Esther? It will be given you. What you are seeking up to half the kingdom, it's yours." So, we kind of maybe think like when Esther goes in there, she hasn't seen the king for over about a month, right? And so then what happens is he comes in and he says, "Esther, whatever it is you want up to half the kingdom, it's yours." And she says, "Well, will you come to a banquet with me today?" Right? And then while she's at that banquet with the king and Haman, she says, can you come back?" And he kind of says the same thing. He's like, "Esther, whatever it is, please, up to half the kingdom, it's yours." And I think in that regard, as soon as you see, this response, or at least this restating of this promise, I think you get this notion of thinking, you've seen it so many times that it seems like the king's pretty set on saying, "Esther, I want to solve whatever problem you have," which I think is good. It's obviously good for Esther and the Jewish people.
When you think about it happening more than once, it's almost like she's kind of being humble about it and not asking instantly, where Haman, when he has that opportunity, what should be done for this person, it's like instantly, "I know what to do," and she's almost more playing her cards a little more humbly, so that it's almost like the king is like, "Are you ever going to tell me?"
Well, if anything in this regard, I think she's definitely playing her cards, and I think the best construction to put on it is she's humbly saying, like, "I don't know what this is," whatever way you take it. I think you have to admit, Esther goes about this probably in the best way that she possibly could, and that's actually the next question: is how did Esther show tact and diplomacy as she asked Xerxes to grant her request? And then I have a little note about some different translations, because there is a different way to take this. But first, let's just look how it's written in the EHV. So Esther is asked, and finally here comes the request. And this is what Esther says. And I think to myself, think of all the different ways that she could explain this or ask for this, the way she does it is probably the best way you possibly could. Now, so here's how she does it. She says, "My king, if I have found favor in your eyes." I mean, we know that she has, because she's alive, right? And that golden scepter has been extended to her, and he was pleased to see her. But I think this sets the precedence for the, like, you know, if you really like me, or if I'm pleasing to you, then I have something that you could help me with. So if I have found favor in your eyes, and if it pleases the king, I am asking that my life be spared, and I am seeking the lives of my people, because I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we were merely being sold to be male and female slaves, I would have remained silent, because that would not have been bad enough to be a reason to bother the king. So think about the way in which she goes about presenting this question before the king. And I mean, it is. What kind of tact and diplomacy does she show? Go for it, Debs.
She's, you know, I don't want to impose upon you, king, but if, then I'm asking for this. And I also find it interesting that she says people to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. It's progressively, not just merely killed, but annihilated.
Mm-hmm. Judy.
Well, you get the impression that he has no clue that this was planned. How could he not know that he had agreed to let the Jews kill?
He was living in
That's
exactly
bureaucracy.
This is a very important note to hit on, because I think what's interesting is what is not included in her request.
She doesn't identify as a Jew.
She doesn't identify as a Jew. She eliminates the notion of this group of people, and she equates them with, which would really be the ramification of the decree that is issued by Haman, is that she would be gone. And so she places herself before the king and says, my life is at risk. I mean, like, to me, that's the best card you can play. You are the queen. Obviously, the king cares about the queen, right? No mention in there whatsoever is Mordecai's name mentioned, which I think is a humble thing, right? Because in this regard, we don't even actually know if Esther knows whether or not Mordecai has been exalted or not. We don't even know that. So there's no like, well, I think maybe you'd almost come to the point where either she's humble or she's just kind of finding out about it and doesn't know everything that's going on. And so in this regard, because this is all happened in one day's time. And if she does know, then she is humbly saying, like, maybe you don't care about the Jews, but I'm guessing you care about me, right? Or maybe she's asking the question, you know, if I've found favor in your eyes and this is a good thing for you, would you save me and my people? It is. I don't know how you could go about asking or asking this question in any better way whatsoever. Because I think, if it's true, Judy, which I think is true, I don't think he really fully understands everything that's going on. Which I think is something most certainly that you kind of have to be like, oh, that seems strange. I also think it's strange that he obviously doesn't know that her life is threatened, which means he doesn't really know where Esther comes from.
Right.
Which I think is also kind of interesting in and of itself. Right?
He doesn't really care, though. He just likes the beauty, and he doesn't care.
I don't know. And that's one of those things. That's it's kind of we'll say it's the thing that maybe causes us to scratch our head a lot is that there's a lot of stuff that you're like, I just don't know. I mean, it's clear that he cares about Esther in some fashion or some form, because he's like, of course, who would ever do this to my queen? And I think in this regard, I don't even know if Haman would know that she's a Jew either. And this might be a
Oh,
revealing
yeah,
to
for
Haman,
sure.
in the notion of saying, oh no. And I
Yeah, but
think,
his wife though was warning.
yeah, his wife warned him about who though? Mordecai. Right? The notion is if Mordecai, whom you are going up against, is a Jew,
Yeah.
you're not going to beat him. And then Esther comes along and says, King, my life is in danger. Someone has sentenced my people to die. Me and my people to die. King, would you do something about this? And I think the humble part too at the very end, which I think display or not doesn't really matter. If only we'd been sold as slaves, wouldn't have been a big deal. But because the decree was that we would be killed and annihilated, then I bring it before the king. And I don't know. It's kind of an amazing, and even in that regard, right, I would remain silent because me being a slave is not something that the king should be concerned about.
I'm just curious about the destroyed, killed, and annihilated in Hebrew, if there's anything,
NIV is better, slaughtered.
Yeah, there is different words that are put in there.
Sold for destruction and slaughtered and annihilated.
I think.
but is there any alliteration or anything in Hebrew?
I need to look. Let's see here.
But you know, when you read stuff like this and you put yourself in the person's spot so that you suddenly become Esther, I never would have thought to say it that way. I probably just would have panicked and said, they're going to kill all the Jews. She's so smart to do it that way.
But she gave herself that name.
And she thinks and come
Well,
to the
see, that-
banquet and then another banquet.
I don't think it's just about her beauty. I think she must have had a lot of intelligence that Xerxes could see and was able to bond with that part of her too.
Well,
Yeah,
and
probably.
that actually would bring us to this next one. There's similar syllables, but I don't know if there's actually like alliteration. I think what you have here is exactly what you were saying. There's this building up, and I think these words are here because of the decree that was issued by Mordecai, which is not only that they would die, but that we would then also plunder all of the things that they have. Right? It's one thing to say we're going to kill these people. It's another thing to say we're going to completely wipe them off the face of the earth. All the things that they had will now be gone. We're going to take them and they're going to be ours now. Yes?
Okay, I'm going to reach back now. So I watched this movie called One Night with the King. It's about Esther. And so, but they have this connection between Samuel and Saul when he was supposed to kill the Amalekites.
Yeah.
And then they had this connection. I think it was Haman. I was kind of watching it and I kind of doing other things. And
So we briefly touched on that
Yeah.
at the very beginning, and that's because Haman is considered to be from an Agite. And if you remember, the Amalekites, whom Saul was supposed to wipe out completely, their king's name was Agag. Right? And so there is some speculation that Haman would come from this line.
so then you can see, and I'm not saying he's doing the right thing, but you can kind of see where his family has maybe carried this anger and annihilation against the Jews.
It's possible. I can't say it's not. Right? Because in this regard, we don't actually know 100% if that's the case.
We're not telling you all the background, you know.
Yeah, and there's some commentators speculate this is where, as an Agite, this is where he comes from, the king Agag. I don't really know. Some suggest that it's not from a specific guy or family line, but a specific region, which would make sense too. And so in this regard, I can't say yes or no. But people do speculate in that regard. And in that sense, then, it could fit. It rightfully could fit, right? If you were to be, if you're somehow in line with the Amalekites, which, in this regard, I would say, the reality is that were the Amalekites destroyed completely? For the most part, I think they were, right? The only thing that they brought back was the king and then the best of their cattle, right? That's 1 Samuel 15, I believe. And then what happens? Samuel goes and kills the king because Saul didn't. And the king, King Agag, was like, well, it actually says that he thought death was past him. And then Samuel goes in as a prophet and actually kills him to carry out the word of the Lord that was actually spoken by Samuel himself. So I don't know, but I think in that regard there is the mindset that it's possible. Does that make sense?
Yeah, because I know we had that discussion of why are people so down on the Jews, or why was he so down?
Well, if your people were destroyed by them, that would make you angry with them. I don't necessarily know if this is the case here, though. And I can't say that it's not, though. So, sorry. No answer. But I think as you look at this, and maybe just jump to this passage. This is the passage that came to my mind when I was looking at this, and just kind of thinking about the way in which Esther responds. Right? Jesus says as he's sending his disciples out, look, I'm sending you out as sheep among wolves, so be as shrewd as snakes and as innocent as doves. Use your head, people. Use your head. And I think when you look exactly at the way Esther does this, I think there was considerable thought in the way she went about doing this. I don't know how you couldn't. I don't know how you couldn't. Like, I can imagine that Esther, if the first day was like, I just don't know what to say, then that whole night when the king is not sleeping, I'd imagine maybe she wasn't sleeping because she's like, how do I present this to him? How do I present this to him? And I think in that regard, then she's like, think about what this would cause. All this whole decree, think about what would cause. And then how would it affect the king? Which to me is probably the best play. I would be gone. I'm the queen. And that leads me to this other thing is this verse 4 is kind of interesting, right? And this whole part, everybody kind of translates this the same. There is a variant reading with the way in which the Hebrew words are ordered that causes this last part to be rendered a little bit differently. The EHV I don't think has anything on it, but the NIV includes a footnote to it. And where is it at? Right here. I would have kept quiet because no such distress would justify disturbing the king. There are some Hebrew words in there that have a little bit different, if the vowel pointings are a little bit different, it comes out to read a little bit different. And so then it would be, I would have kept quiet, but the compensation of our enemy or our adversary offers, so like what Haman is offering to you by annihilating all of us cannot be compared with the loss the king would suffer. So yes, Haman, remember he said, what would he give the king? 10,000 of silver.
That's a lot.
And I don't know exactly, I mean, I think what the EHV has is probably the way I would translate it, but even if you did take this kind of variant idea, it still fits very well into this text. Essentially, this Esther is saying, because what is being offered actually wouldn't be an advantage to the king. Because what would be happening is you'd be losing this whole group of people. And even if you lost, I mean, like, even if that took place, that would actually render, it'd be worse for you. It'd be worse for you as a king. Please.
This whole group of very productive people. They
Right.
were productive people.
Right. And I think in this regard, so like, there is this kind of like, that's not a, I mean, you think about it, and it's kind of, I would say in this regard,
That movie did that.
Mm-hmm.
I think in this regard, it does fit in the line of thought that's there. So in that sense, you could take it that way, and some translations do. I don't know. I have several up here, but this is the King James. It takes although the enemy could not countervail the king's damage, right? Haman, even if he paid you, wouldn't be able to make this a better situation for the king. So it takes that alternate reading. This is the ESV. Merely slaves, I was silent, for our affliction is not compared with the loss to the king. So that would also take, I would say that would also take that variant reading. And then I would have been silent indeed. The trouble wouldn't be worth burdening the king. This takes the same reading as the NIV does and the EHV does. So just a little bit of a variant there, but kind of an interesting little bit of a twist on the thought that comes out in that section. Which is, I mean, I think is worth thinking about. Obviously, that's why we're looking at it. But just an amazing amount of tact by Esther to come forward and say, you know, Esther has this request, Esther has this request. And I even think the pushing off, the asking King Xerxes, I think probably, whether it was in her mind or not, helps her. Right? Because King Xerxes is like, I want to know what this is. It's obviously bothering you. You've thrown a banquet for me 2 days in a row. I want to be able to help you. And then to hear that. And then the next question is we'll see the way in which the king responds. How does Xerxes respond to her request? And I read this in the NIV, which I really kind of enjoyed, the 84. I don't necessarily, I'm looking to see.
It flows a lot better than.
I really like the way the NIV translated this, just because I find it enjoyable. So King Xerxes hears it, and what is his response immediately? Who is this?
Yeah.
I'm the king. No one will threaten the life of my queen. I think, I don't know if that's what he's thinking, but where is the man who dares to do such a thing? This is a terrible thing. Who is this guy? And then I think it's kind of interesting the way that I like how Esther refers to Haman, who is absolutely in the presence of the king. It's not just it's Haman, it's
Vile.
yeah,
An adversary.
an adversary and an enemy. The vile Haman. That's the king's buddy. That's the king's drinking buddy, if we remember correctly, right? And so in this regard, Esther essentially says, "You're your friend. He's not a friend. He's an enemy. He's an adversary. He's evil." I think that actually might be what the EHV says.
Audacity to do.
This hateful enemy is this evil Haman. Yeah. And then obviously, what do we see? I think what I really enjoy about the NIV is the way they translated this, which it says then Haman was terrified before the king and the queen, and then this is what I like. The king got up in rage, and this is what I think is interesting. He left his wine and went out to the palace garden. I think that's an interesting note in my mind. Like, what do we see of the king, even from the very, very beginning? This man is all about the wine. This man is all about enjoying the luxuries. And this instance has got him leaving his wine behind and heading out to the palace garden. I mean, it seems like it's such an interesting little detail that I enjoy. And then
And did his wine contribute to his anger?
I have no
His
idea.
rage?
It's very possible. It's very possible. But then, how does Haman respond? Oh, go ahead, Bob. Sorry.
Oh, I just getting back to the king not knowing what's going on, because if he had known that Esther was a Jew or whatever, because he had done all that, it looks kind of silly that he didn't know who the guy was that did it.
Yeah. Right. Absolutely. It is something to be said. That's a good observation, Judy and Bob, is that for whatever reason, Xerxes has no idea. And this is kind of a big deal. I mean, it hits real close to home, and yet he's seemingly oblivious to it. It is something to think about and say, like, that's strange. That's kind of a strange thing. Which in my mind is just you said bureaucracy. I think absolutely the notion of he's just trying to please people most of the time. When his buddy comes in and says, "Hey, I got this proposition, I want it to be done," he's like, "Okay, whatever." You know what?
But you can really see, how we talked about how she drug it out and I need another day, but you can see how God makes it all work together, because then the king can't sleep, and then it's like,
Yeah.
oh, so all this is coming. I mean, sometimes you don't think the Lord is in everything, but he is, and it's amazing. Even a terrible thing, he's working it for good.
Yeah,
So-
absolutely.
Well, just another point, where Esther was thinking about what to say, but the Lord said, you don't have to think about it, I'll tell you what to say.
Yeah, when he's talking to his disciples and stuff, right? Yeah, don't worry about what to say. My spirit will guide you, or my spirit will speak over you. Obviously, the Lord blesses people with wisdom and tact in some difficult situations. That's 100% true. I think this is clearly the case for this. I think there's a little bit of guidance from the Lord. Whether it's known or not to Esther, we don't know. But I think most certainly it is. And you can see the unfolding of it. I mean, right? How does Haman respond when he was exposed for the type of person he was? This vile adversary, this enemy of the king. What does he do?
He's gonna beg.
He's gonna beg! Yeah. It is kind of amazing. But Haman, realizing that the king had already decided his fate, stayed behind and to beg Queen Esther for his life. Just think about the irony of this picture.
Yeah.
Why did
He wants to love her.
what caused Haman to be so upset with Mordecai?
His pride.
His pride, but Mordecai would not do what?
Wouldn't give him honor.
He wouldn't bow down. He wouldn't come before him and kind of give him the respect that he thought he deserved. And now, here at the very end, what is he doing?
He's groveling.
He's doing everything he can before Queen Esther to save his life. And what's really maybe even more ironic is that this kind of like overly like begging actually causes him to get into
Deeper trouble.
deeper trouble. I think he was. I mean, it's very clear that. Well, let's see here. Haman realized his fate was over. He knew it, right? So his last ditch effort is to beg Queen Esther, please don't let the king do what he's going to do, which he already he knows he's done for. But in the midst of all of this, it is kind of an amazing thing to see that as he is begging, he seems to fall over on the couch or even close to Queen Esther, or maybe even on Esther herself. And then the king comes in and he is even more angry. The NIV says, well, even molest the queen while she is with me in the house. Yeah, just kind of an amazing. Everything seems to be kind of just turning. Yeah.
It just thrills me and amazes me to know at what a master playwright the good Lord is. I mean.
Yeah, the way these events unfold is truly remarkable, right? And I think that was what leads to this next question. The details of this account were used by the Lord to deliver Israel. And then there's a question about your own life, which is application. But I also think it's kind of amazing that, after we see all this unfold, after we get to see that Haman's not going to survive and the king's angry with him, then who enters the room? This eunuch. And what does he say? Well, there's a pole. Like, he's going to get hung. Like, we know that. Well, guess what? There's a pole, 75 feet or 50 cubits, and it's right outside his house. He built it so that he could hang Mordecai. And the king's like, oh, great. Let's use that to hang him. Yeah.
What is the difference between impaled on the pole and hung on the gallows? I mean, why is there this difference in the translation?
That one's just, let's see here. Let's see what the EHV gives us or impaled. I think the notion is that it just says like stuck. I'd have to look specifically at that word. Let's see here. Actually, this might be better than you guys can maybe see it a little better too.
It could be more gruesome than hanging up. Oh, no.
Yeah.
So did he not have any did he just think to himself that I can't fall on the mercy of the king? I know the king left in a rage, but when he came back, he must have known him well enough that there's no way you can even
Well, and they
beg
saw
from
him
the
falling
king.
on top of Esther, and the king
Yeah.
misunderstood
Yeah.
that, so,
He's lost, he's
yeah, I think.
burned
he's
all his
burned
bridges.
his
Yeah,
bridges.
there's no way he's making that out alive, I don't think.
But if you're desperate for your life, you'd think you'd still beg even the king,
Well,
but
maybe he did,
not.
I think
I don't know.
he went about a terrible way of doing it as far as.
So this is
Maybe
why you
all
have
the
a
way to
difference in
gallows.
translation.
After
One
all
says
around.
hang up and the other says dangle. Both of those are literal translations for this word. So it very well could have been, and I'm guessing the reason that the NIV chooses impale is probably because that maybe is more common with the way in which the Persians treat their enemy, is to stick them on a stick, which is not an uncommon treatment. Not an uncommon treatment.
There wasn't any treatment in the States either.
That's an interesting.
Gruesome. Either
Well,
way.
it's a visual it's really a billboard to everybody,
Yeah.
is what it is.
You better not.
And that's
do
not
it.
and that's not an uncommon thing. In fact,
That's pretty much what crucifixion was too.
yeah, and that's part of the reason why it's part of the reason why I think Jonah, when he's told to go to the Assyrians, is like, I'm not going there. Those people don't deserve to go there. Because they would put them along the street as you're walking into the city. They'd have their enemies skinned and impaled and setting up in front of the, like on the road as you're walking to
Well, it isn't any different than in the United States in the 1800s, out here in the West, in Kansas, and how many other places did they have gallows? Probably out in Deadwood. You know, they,
Swing them.
yeah.
Yep. Yeah. I think it's just a way in which those who are in positions of authority essentially try to say, we're at authority. And if you don't think we are, here's the proof. And if you think that you can get away with stuff, this is your future. Right? It is gruesome, 100%. But in that regard, that is the way they operated. The way they operated. So, looking back at your life, have you ever seen a time when relatively small detail became the key to how the Lord delivered you from trouble, or how He gave you a great blessing? Right? That's what we see in this account. There's these little details that just seem to kind of all work up or all unfold and really work to the benefit of, well, Esther and the Jewish people as they are saved from this evil man and his evil plot. Go for it.
I worked at several defense contractors, and it seemed as though every time the administration changed, the contracts that we might have been working on were changed over to another company or something, and so a few times I fell into the category of those who were let go because the contract had been ended. And I look back now and I see, well, I'm glad I'm not at that company. They're not good.
Yeah. Well, I think I mean the saying hindsight's 20/20.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's easier to count your blessings
After the
after the fact rather than during. I think 100% true. 100% true. It is a blessing that the Lord then sometimes allows us to look at and say, oh, this is how you were working. I didn't see it at the time, but you were working. Most certainly you were. And that, in that regard, we would say by faith we know that to be true. Sometimes looking back on our lives, we get the privy of saying, oh, of course, Lord. This seems to be what your plan was, and it was obviously for my betterment, for my good. Yeah. All right.
I've been looking at different things on YouTube just because I've investigated Dr. Lillihigh, and I knew that having open heart surgery in '63 was pretty amazing, but I read King of Hearts. It's all about him. He trained all these different doctors, but they didn't perfect that till 57, and then I had that in 63, and they couldn't do it because they didn't have the heart-lung machine, and he figured out how to do that with plumbing from milking machines and what you find when you drink beer in the bar, and ended up making all those things. And I just keep thinking how I didn't realize all of that. And here he was alive in the 70s in Minnesota, and I was in New Ulm, and I still didn't know. And it's like you look back and think, wow, that all really worked together well, and
Yeah.
amazing.
How it dovetails.
Yeah,
Yep.
you see it later in life, but I found videos of him, and then you see what surgery looked like in the 60s, and I keep telling Mary, I can't believe I lived through that. I know, because I have it on Nova or something, just a little. He ended up training 800 different cardiac, even Christian Barnard, who did the other stuff. So I still, I just always am so amazed at that, how that all works together. And
Yeah. The Lord blesses people.
you know, you just take it for granted when you're a little kid.
Yeah. Well, I would say maybe also as an adult too. I mean, I think so. But right, the Lord works, and sometimes things that don't seem relevant to our lives actually do seem to impact us in a way, for our benefit. All right. I don't know if are there any other questions on chapter 7? Otherwise, we're going to jump into chapter 8. Longer than chapter 7, but not as, I'll say not as, in my mind, it is interesting, but not as interesting as chapter 7. And I thought it made good sense to just do the remaining 4 after 6. So 7 and 8 today, and then 9 and 10 next week. So we'll read through the rest of, we'll read through chapter 8, and then we'll ask a couple of questions on it. So that day King Xerxes gave Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. Mordecai came and appeared before the king because Esther had told him what Mordecai's relationship to her was. The king took off his signet ring that he had taken from Haman and gave it to Mordecai. Esther put Mordecai in charge of the house of Haman. In addition, Esther spoke to the king. She fell at his feet, wept, and requested that he put an end to the evil plan that Haman the Agagite had devised against the Jews. The king held out the golden scepter to Esther. Esther rose and stood in the presence of the king. She said, "If it is acceptable to the king, if I have found favor before him, if this idea seems right to the king, and if I am acceptable to him, a decree should be written to nullify the letters for the plot of Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, which he wrote to destroy the Jews in all the provinces of the king. For how can I watch the disaster that is about to come on my people? How can I watch the destruction of my relatives?" King Xerxes said to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, "Look, I have given Haman's house to Esther. They have hanged him on the gallows because he raised his hand against the Jews. You can write concerning the Jews whatever seems good to you, and seal it with the king's signet ring, because a document written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's signet ring cannot be changed." The king's scribes were summoned at once. On the 23rd day of Shiva, the 3rd month, whatever Mordecai commanded concerning the Jews was written to the satraps, governors, and officials of the provinces from India to Cush, 127 provinces in all. They wrote to each province in its own writing system and to each people in its own language, including to the Jews in their writing system and in their language. He wrote in the name of King Xerxes and sealed it with the king's signet ring. He sent letters by messengers mounted on the king's fastest thoroughbreds. The king gave the Jews in every city the right to gather together to defend their own lives and to destroy, kill, and annihilate any military force or any people or province that might attack them, along with their children and their wives, and to plunder their goods. In all the provinces of King Xerxes, a copy of the writing, which was issued as a law to every province, proclaimed to all the peoples that on one day, the 13th day of the 12th month of Adar, the Jews would be ready to avenge themselves on their enemies. The couriers riding their swift horses went out quickly, spurred on by the word of the king. The decree originated in Susa, the citadel, Mordecai went out from the king's presence dressed in blue and white royal clothing, with a large gold crown and a purple linen cape. The city of Susa shouted and rejoiced. It was a time of light, gladness, joy, and honor for the Jews. In every province and in every city which the message of the king reached, his edict brought gladness and joy to the Jews. There was a feast and a holiday. Many of the peoples of the land declared themselves Jews because the fear of the Jews had fallen upon them. All right, so there's a lot in there, but mainly what you have is this section is really an overriding, we'll say. You can't really undo it because it was issued by the king, the law of Haman, right? And so then there has to be a law written in response to that to essentially tell the Jews that if people attack you, you can fight them back. And you can destroy them and their family, and you can take their goods. So it's kind of an interesting thing. But the problem that needed to be addressed was that this day was still on the books, right? Haman's gone, but his plan is still enacted, right? Because all of the notes and all the things had already been sent out to all the places. And so now they have to go back and they have to kind of undo that, right? And so that's exactly what you see taking place. And the guy who does undo it is Mordecai. King Xerxes says, Mordecai, you write whatever seems good to you, and I'll stamp it and I'll put my name on it. Bob.
I'm just curious on that. Were the Jews slaves then of the king still, or could they? I don't understand how they couldn't defend themselves. I guess.
Well, if it's an issue of the king, and it's essentially saying that we're just going to kill, annihilate, and take all their stuff, I think this would be essentially labeling the Jews as enemies to the kingdom. And I think in that sense, they could have fought. But I think what you would have seen is, I think if Mordecai was still alive and his plan would have been carried out, I think they would have actually used the royal army to do
That's
this.
what I was wondering.
Yeah. Which, in all honesty, I don't think they could do much. You know what I mean? Like, they might try to fight, but what are you going to do? Yeah. And here, then what you see is, as Mordecai writes this, he kind of reverses it. And he says, this shouldn't really happen, but if someone does, you have the right to defend yourself. In the sense of, you won't go, or you won't see ramification or penalty if you kill somebody else, and you take their things, and you plunder their goods, right? It is in this regard, we would say, it is the royal decree to allow the Jews to essentially it's not essentially that, but essentially almost create little military to defend themselves, which is kind of a remarkable thing that the king would actually say, we're okay with this.
Well, then on that last verse it said, many of the peoples of the land declared themselves Jews because the fear of the Jews had fallen on them. And
Yeah.
they...
Right. And I would say in this regard, you read that last section, and I have that as one of the questions at the end, and maybe it's not that, it's this one. I think it's quite interesting to see the fact that the fear of the Jews was already really there.
Yeah,
And now you
because
see it
wanna get
increase
rid of them.
more. Which I think in this sense, I think that's partly because of, it's a fear of the Jews, but I think you have the notion of like the Solomon and Queen of the South kind of discussion. She recognizes Solomon as the king of the Jews, and she sees this elaborate kingdom, but then there's also a recognition that who's responsible for that.
Yeah, I was
It's
gonna
the
say,
Lord.
They realize
Right.
that there's another God. They have
Yeah.
a God that's greater than ours.
Yeah, and I think that's really what you get coming in play here. In my mind, that's what I think. Right, because you see Zeresh, Haman's wife, say, if he's a Jew,
You're going down.
you can't overcome him. Well, why in the world would it be because he's a Jew?
Of Balaam and Balak.
Yeah, it ultimately comes down to the notion of they have a God that actually cares for them and seems to protect them, which it's true, right? It's true. They serve God, and He does watch over them and protect them. And I wonder in this regard, I wonder how much you read Daniel, and he was alive during the Persian kingship. How much of those stories kind of transition from one reign to another? Where Daniel was sentenced to death in a lion's den, but didn't come about because the Lord was watching over him, right? An angel shut the mouths of the lions, and that was during the Persian kingdom. It was before Xerxes, but it was the same kingdom. It wasn't the Babylonians that happened under. It happened underneath the Persians. So, I thought, it is also interesting to think about the time frame for which this takes place, right? So in what month was this second decree written, and in what month was it to take effect? If you remember all the way back at the beginning, the decree was to take place in the 12th month. And we find ourselves not in the 12th month, but here in I believe it's the 3rd month.
Plenty of time to get the word out.
To get the word out, but not only get the word out, but for the Jews to actually equip themselves and prepare themselves for that day. It would be one thing if, the decree went out and it was like a month away.
That'd be a scramble.
It almost would be impossible for them to defend themselves if they didn't have, weapons or other things, right? Not only would you have to purchase those weapons, but you'd probably want to train with those weapons and stuff like that. So enough time for them to do everything that they would need in order to make sure that they are
Get organized.
that they're in a safe spot. And I think that's part of the reason why you get that at the very end. Like, they watched the Jews go about preparing themselves for this potential, not necessarily going to be, but potential attack. And I think in that sense, then you have people saying like, oh, yeah, I don't want to go against them. I don't want to go against them. All right. God blesses his people in many ways. To some, he gives ample resources. Some, sometimes more than they need. To others, he gives wisdom. To others, he gives happy family lives. To others, he gives success in business. Have you ever viewed God's blessings to you as a means through which the Lord is attracting others to his kingdom, or to learn more about your hope? Discuss the idea.
I think pretty much all your life is being changed by God, and you see after a while, after it happens, then you say, okay, this wasn't my choice, but God wanted it this way.
I think also too, it maybe makes us a little bit, if we think about it from this notion, we would say it maybe makes us more conscious on how we present ourselves to the people around us, right? The Lord does bless us, and not to be afraid to make that known, right? And I'm not saying anybody in here would have this problem, but I think in this regard, sometimes even the blessings that the Lord gives us, we don't recognize them, or we aren't as thankful as maybe we should be. And I would say in this regard, people are watching us no matter what. No matter what you do, people are watching you. And so I think in this sense, if you think about it really from this perspective, then in this regard, not a bad thing to really essentially attach those two things, right? The Lord and the blessings he gives to us. And then also, to say like, this is something the Lord does for his people. Which is part of the reason why the Jews had this reputation with all the other people, right? They're essentially like, well, if you're going up against the Jews, you just forget about it.
Yeah, it's already known.
Yeah.
They've already got that worldwide view of them.
Right, and I think in that regard, that at least in my mind, that's where the pointing of that is like, what makes you special? Well, you're special because you have a God who loves you and takes care of you and blesses you in specific ways, right? And I think that is an important thing for us to think about as we live in this world. And then as we give credit, maybe we'd say where credit is due, right? And then to look for opportunities to say, oh, here's how the Lord's blessed me. Here's how the Lord's blessed me. He loves to bless people. Loves to bless people. I don't know if there's anything else on that. And we kind of already talked about that, so I'm done. I don't know if anybody has any other questions or anything like that over chapters 7 and 8.
So is this in history of Xerxes? If you look for just the
Timeline.
general histories, does this all pop up, I wonder? I mean, that'd be a question for historians, I know, but
So
maybe it would tell me that in
So
the
you have,
Jewish
so you
Bible.
have, no, so you have like, you have this interesting dilemma, because you do have certain events that are recorded in history, but oftentimes like things like, I would say like this, probably is not the best looking. I mean, like you've already said it.
It's probably pretty small
Well, I mean, you think about,
compared to
we,
the whole.
but you think about too. You think about, you've already said, how could Xerxes not know about this stuff? It actually paints him in a negative view. That type of stuff doesn't get recorded.
Right.
And I think that's part of the reason. This is me recalling from memory, and I'll double check it, and I'll bring it back to you next. But I almost think that's part of also another reason why Esther is, spoken against, is that there's not a mention
Okay.
of her. There's not a mention of really this event taking place. I mean, it obviously took place because what do you have?
Dates?
You have dates, but then also you have a specific festival that is attached to this that the Jews still celebrate today. And in my mind, that's all you need,
Yeah.
right? I mean, like, some people might say, well, they look back at this book and then but I highly doubt that, right? And I think in that sense, that's where I would go. So I am trying to think if I can, I really do think I read somewhere that that's part of the reason why they're like, we don't know if Esther should be in there, because there's not necessarily this very specific, like, oh yeah, Esther's written in this, There are certain parts of the history, and I believe it's Herodotus that you look at for this. I think that's who records some of this stuff. I think. I'll have to go back and look. This is part of my memory, which might be failing me. But he does write about Xerxes, and he has very interesting depictions of Xerxes, and he does record certain things that seem to kind of line up with what we see in this book, especially at the very beginning with the disposal of Vashti and other things of that nature. So I'll look into that this week and maybe come back to you. Your study Bible might have notes on that, but I really, for some reason, that sticks in my head. That I think I
That
read
doesn't
that.
seem like a reason to keep it out.
I think
like a non-biblical reason. I mean,
well,
you
but
know,
I mean, like in
I
this
don't know how
regard,
to
if
say
you're looking at it from the aspect of textual criticism,
it, then you want proof
Right.
another way.
Right.
Okay.
and so I think in that sense, that's essentially that for us. It's history.
Yeah.
Like that doesn't make a difference to me.
Right.
But some who look to understand, this text and where it came from, they're the ones that are there's the ones that are maybe calling into question the notion of saying, well, if there's really nothing written about this, then maybe it's not. You know what I mean? Yeah. Debs.
Just curious why the King James Version and the modern versions, the King James Version has the Hebrew name of Xerxes, and our more modern translations use Xerxes, the Greek name.
It comes down to, I would say, translator philosophy or preference. So in this regard, so like in my mind, if I was to guess, EHV or ESV should have the Hebrew name, and I don't know if I saw
It is right there.
Yeah. So in that regard, their translation philosophy is, we're going to give you as clear a picture of the original language as possible. Now they can't do that completely, because then you couldn't maybe read it in English. You have to make some kind of so like they have Asher. I actually don't even know how I would pronounce that, but I'd probably look at the Hebrew for a better pronunciation than the English. But so they're going to give you the name that's written in Hebrew.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if you get to like the NIV or maybe even the EHV, the notion is who's when they're reading it, who are we talking about? And I would say most people are probably going to know I would say they're going to probably know Xerxes. They're going to recognize that name before they recognize the King James, the name that they use from the Hebrew. And so I think that's probably part of the reason why the NIV or the EHV say, you know what, maybe let's use Xerxes, because that actually is what, you know, when you're talking about in the notion of when people are talking about Xerxes in the aspect from a historical perspective, that's oftentimes the name that's used and more people would recognize than this other name. Does that make sense? So it comes down to translator preference, or I'll say translation philosophy. So there has to be, in my mind, that's the benefit of having multiple translations, right? You can look at them and say, well, why is this way, why is that way? The NSAB is also very literal, so it probably has the Hebrew name. But then you have like, some things you look at and you go, if this is really your philosophy, why did you translate it this way? You know what I mean? And part of that is just because sometimes you just got to make a choice. You just have to say, how are we going to do this? And we're going to be consistent. If I was translating, I'd probably use Xerxes, just because I think more people would recognize Xerxes than the Hebrew name for Xerxes. Just because we want people to understand what's there. And it's not like using Xerxes anchors it into history more, because it doesn't. But it just allows people to make those connections maybe a little easier. Any other questions? All right, let's pray and then you can leave. Gracious Father in heaven, we thank you. We thank you for time and your word. We thank you for, your care, the way you work all the little details of our life out for our good. Move us to find great joy and comfort in the fact that you do this. You did it for Esther, and you also do it for us. Move us just to find joy and delight in the way that you care for your people. We ask this in Jesus' name.